along with our students. And this year, you have met my capable team, Leo and Deborah and Cyril already. They have never heard such a resounding and fast yes. Because for over 12 years, I led at the Harvard Kennedy School a program called the Future of Diplomacy Project. And what we were trying to do there is exactly what Lord Brian Griffiths told us about, which is to prepare the next generation for the complexity of international problems. But mostly what we were trying to do is what we're going to try to do these next two days extremely actively, which is listen. Because for me, the collaboration, the curiosity, this innate fervor to get things done is what humbled me most about working with the next generation for the last 12 years. And that is why I'm here, and I profoundly believe that is why you're here as well. Harvard and St. Gallen share many academic ambitions, but they also share a commitment to experiential learning, which I know because Philippe Narval is here and he heads the Square, and the Square is dedicated to innovation in learning. So as we're changing our setup here, let's do some experiential learning together. You heard from Leo our mission for the next 2 days, to have conversations that are different, that are wide-ranging, maybe sometimes uncomfortable, and that starts right here. Could you take a look to the right and left of you and see who you're sitting next to? Now, is that a member of your own generation? Or is that a member of the next generation? Are you already fulfilling your assignment? Or do you have some work to do? Well, this buzz rivals the buzz off of the leaders of tomorrow that I got yesterday on stage. But our organizers have made it easy for us. So if you're not already buzzing, I'll give you some help. There is a little guide to winning the next 2 days, and I'll share it with you. So if you're not sitting next to somebody who is of a different generation than you are, here is how you're going to find them. 5 conversations over the next 2 days. Leaders of tomorrow, yellow badges. Aspiring leaders, green badges. Speakers, they're multi-generational, white badges. And the leaders of our student committee and the 500 volunteers, white badges and buttons. Everybody clear on their homework, yes? Look at you engaging in this experimental learning task, right? Harvard and St. Gallen, our academic traditions, would be very proud of you. In the meantime, we've done a special kind of magic on this stage, is that we've transformed our conversation platform already. Now I have to get you to quiet down because I'm about to bring people on this stage who have important things to share with you. 5 years. According to the UN Development Agency, 5 years of human thriving is what we have lost. And the report that the UNDP issues every single year comes out in the fall and is retrospective. So the UNDP report that came out last fall didn't even take into consideration the cataclysmic effects, the direct effects of the brutal war of the Russian Federation across the sovereign territory of Ukraine, the human suffering, the pain, the humanitarian injustice, and the violation of international law. It didn't yet take into consideration what we all now know, how deeply interconnected we are, how our energy supplies, how our financial flows, how our flow of grain, of fertilizer, of raw materials somehow all is inexplicably but inextricably linked in a way that a disruption of the kind that we had at the heart of Europe affects the entire globe. Whether they link it to that issue exactly or don't, our humanity is linked together like never before. And yet, even before we were able to make that measurable, we had already gambled. We'd gambled on our future, we'd gambled on the effects of climate change, we had drawn down resources, we had drawn down on our own common thriving. 5 years. And it's not to say that we won't be able to recapture that 5 years. The UNDP report is somewhat optimistic, at least in the end, but we need to change some of our fundamental behaviors. How, in this time of consistent perma and polycrises, where we heard it from Lord Griffiths, our populations feel stretched, they feel vulnerable, they do not know where to look for guidance, our governance systems don't serve them anymore. How do we get out of a stage of permacrisis? Can we get to anything that resembles long-term planning? Can we advance together, in part by having a new set of conversations that lead to a new set of actions? That's what I'm going to explore with this first, our opening panel. And so with this, let me welcome my panel to the stage. Please. So whether in government or business, the pressure to pursue and accelerate a series of goals, but to harness transformations, to think about transformations in a different way that unites all manner of sectors, and it pushes us to think about how we redefine resilience, how we not only land at this idea of can we roll back this polycrisis and the sense of constant anxiety into some sort of version of getting ahead, bouncing forward instead of just bouncing back. And I want to explore these questions over the next hour with this most excellent panel. I'm thrilled that all the way from Singapore, Minister Desmond Lee is with us, jet-lagged but sprightly. We had an earlier conversation, and this man can really pick up on a number of nuanced details, so I'm really thrilled that you're here. Let me say a little bit about you. You're the Minister for National Development and the Minister in charge of Social Services Integration in Singapore. Before you entered politics in 2011, yes. You had spent time in the private sector, you had spent time in public service and governance, but he's a lawyer, nothing against lawyers, Lord Brian, and he brings all those perspectives to his work. And because, of course, this wouldn't be a new generational contract if we weren't having a fully intergenerational conversation. So I'm thrilled that Sophie Howe is here, a Welsh woman, the future Generation Commissioner for Wales, just left that position, first time, youngest person certainly to hold that role. She just ceded that role to her successor. When she entered politics, she was the youngest elected councillor in Wales, and she initiated a manifesto for the future to look into how we might provide basic income for all citizens. So welcome, Sophie. And then traveling even further, perhaps, than Minister Lee, and this, don't quote me on my geographic knowledge, is our last panelist. I'm really thrilled you're here. Toby Thorpe, he's the Deputy Mayor of Huon Valley Council in Tasmania. Okay. We'll have a geography quiz. After we just did the experiential learning, we'll have the geography quiz right after that. He is the second Australian winner of the International Zayed Sustainability Prize, launching Tasmania really as a global leader in renewable energy innovation. And he organized the first statewide Climate Leaders Conference in 3 Tasmanian cities, attracting more than 350 student participants. And he's been a driver of change, taking up the mantle of elected governance and represented governance. So Toby, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Minister
Minister Lee, I wanted to start with you. I had the great pleasure of being an Eisenhower Fellow to Singapore because one of the things I study is regenerative urban development. And in a city-state like Singapore, the idea of understanding where citizens are at any moment in time, really understanding the exogenous pressures, the geopolitical pressures that have always imposed itself on Singapore. And I remind you of Singapore's potentially vulnerable geography, but of course also its incredibly diverse population, this idea that you need to create a contiguous societal whole. And yet all those crises which we spoke about, they then become, in part because Singapore is a city-state, they become amplified through extreme density, through extreme movement of people, and through the multi-layer of cultures and languages present in Singapore. So when we look at this question, long-term planning in age of permacrisis, when everything seems vivid all the time, how have you dealt with that in Singapore, and how do you think about that?
Well, thank you. First, let me begin by thanking St. Gallen's for the very kind invitation for me to be able to share my experience in Singapore with the audience, and most importantly, the privilege to be able to learn from my fellow panelists, as well as all of you here over the course of the last few days. This morning, I've already fulfilled 2 out of 5 leaders of tomorrow, and I'll make sure I stick to 3 more. But it's a real delight. It's a very good question. We talk about permacrisis and Singapore. It's really not so much of a choice between us focusing too much on the here and now versus spending effort planning for the long term. Because of our size, our geography, and our circumstances, as a city-state, it is imperative that we take care of today and tomorrow, but also constantly maintain bandwidth to keep an eye on the future, because there is no alternative. First and foremost, for those who have not visited my country, we are 730 square kilometers with 5.5 million people. So we are about 2/3 the population of Switzerland, all squeezed in less than 2% of the land area. And so when I drive around Switzerland, I just marvel at the amount of space you have. But most importantly, we're a city-state, which means there is no plan B, there's no alternative city. The city is the country, and the city succeeds or fails. That determines the fate of the nation. And for those who've followed history, the improbability of our independence makes our earlier generation, and indeed my generation, work extra hard to make sure that this city-state continues to thrive, and that we hand it over in better condition than when we took it over from our predecessors. When it comes to permacrisis, I think the COVID crisis, it beats hands down any current crisis that any government would have to deal with. It's a public health crisis, it's a mental health crisis, it's a job crisis, it's a caregiver crisis, it's a supply chain crisis, and an economic crisis, all rolled into one. And I think ultimately, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Switzerland, whether it's the UK, whether it's Australia, we all have bandwidth limitations at all levels: political leadership, civil service, private sector, people sector. There will always be trade-offs in determining where you place your emphasis. And for a crisis as existential as COVID, particularly for a city-state like ours, where everything changes all at once, and there's such a tremendous fog of war, make a wrong move, and it can take you down a certain trajectory. We had to put a lot of state resources. We had a lot of private sector partnership. The social services and the community pitched in because it was a crisis of a generation. But whilst you meet every single day, you meet on weekends, you meet on public holidays, you realize that actually your point of view gets shorter and shorter. It's about what to do the next hour, what to do tomorrow, what's the plan for next week, let alone next month. And it's very important to, in such kinds of situations, in crises, whether it's a slow boil crisis or whether it's an explosive crisis like COVID, to make sure we keep some bandwidth for the future. Because it's bandwidth, but it's also incentives to determine whether you're short-term or long-term in your view. And so what we did during COVID is that while everyone was just so focused on fighting the pandemic and all its various aspects of it, we kept bandwidth to look beyond the road ahead. Because, borders closed, seaports closed, people cannot travel. For a connected city-state like ours, you might end up fighting the pandemic, winning the battle, looking up and losing the whole war, because your status as a trade hub, port, airport hub may just disappear. And so we had the honor of having many private sector captains of industry partner, my colleagues and I in government, in the public service. Many social sector people came forward, and we established an Emerging Stronger task force to look ahead. We were told the task force for COVID will deal with COVID. You look ahead, and what is beyond the bend? Once COVID ends, will we still be here? And from a crisis, we managed to develop long-term solutions that would aid us in our governance. For instance, the concept of an alliance for action. During COVID, we had many private sector partners who had boots on the ground all over the world, who helped us to get the vaccines, to help us get the masks, to help us get all the things that we needed for public health. But beyond just the crisis, we developed the concept of an alliance for action. For example, we had Mr. Tan Chong Meng from PSA. He worked with someone from Trafigura, worked with government. And we looked at supply chain, because COVID was really about supply chain. The major crisis was supply chain disruption. And we found that, hey, apart from just dealing with supply chain, could we not emerge stronger when the crisis ends with a much more digitalized, coordinated, seamless, end-to-end supply chain, airport, seaport, land? And so we developed SG TradeX. And imagine we had a room full of people from customs, from immigration, from government policymakers. We had the airport people, seaport people. We had the people who were in shipping, people who were in cargo, all sitting there, having worked together on the crisis on a live basis, saying, let's put swim lanes across the whole room, board after board, and determine where are the gaps that we've always been complacent about, and let's take this crisis to make sure that when the crisis ends, we end up in better shape than before. And so it is that short-term focus, but trying to achieve gains for the long term that allow a city-state like Singapore to be able to make a living.
So if you've been listening closely, you heard something really fundamental that I think will inform the rest of our conversation, which is learning. This idea that in crisis, you have to find some way to extricate yourself from the dance floor, as we teach it in leadership at Harvard, and move to the balcony, that kind of perspective, so that you can achieve a learning effect. And before I move on, Minister Lee, if you could, when I was in Singapore, we were discussing how H1N1 had informed how Singapore responded to SARS, and then, of course, how Singapore could, do exactly as you did, see COVID as a holistic problem with all of the levers that you have thought about. Now that you have moved beyond some of that, what are some of the key lessons? You talked about how in preparation now, if you look at the potential return of pandemic disease or a similar cataclysmic crisis that can affect value chains, that can affect really how your population is cared for, what are the 2 or 3 lessons that you then want to extrapolate forward to continue this learning?
Indeed, we learned a painful lesson from SARS. We made sure that we developed a playbook from SARS after having gone through a thorough review. And then, of course, when MERS emerged and threatened to be a major public health problem, it didn't eventually for us. And then when COVID hit, a lot of the playbook came up. Playbook from SARS, playbook from the global financial crisis, where we supported jobs and livelihoods, SARS protecting lives. But it turned out that COVID was a lot more extreme in its amplitude. And therefore, whilst we applied the learning from before, through AARs, after action reviews, learning panels, we made sure that at a certain stage in time, and it was just quite recently, we had a thorough review of what we did for the last few years of COVID, and make sure we developed a playbook for the future, bearing in mind that you must extract the right lessons from COVID. And some of the key things were, for instance, the importance of trust. Right? Trust is hard to earn and very easy to lose, and that's a lesson of governance. That's a lesson for those who are in leadership or in politics. Right? Trust is easy to lose, but very difficult to earn. And crisis communication makes or breaks that trust. And so that coordination, timing was one key lesson that we took away from SARS, from COVID, and we will make sure that we are in a good position to deal with the next pandemic.
So we'll get into public trust in just a second. I want to bring Toby into this conversation, then move on back to Sophie. I had a chance recently to talk to the former National Security Advisor of Barack Obama, General Jim Jones, and he said to me, you know, the thing that I fear the most in terms of our global vulnerability, again, is this idea of simultaneity, which is a big word to effectively say everything, everywhere, all at once, to quote the Oscar winner. Toby, the challenge, and I think Minister Lee has mapped it extremely well. There are the sort of slow-moving challenges that we see, but again, there's the known unknowns, there's the unknown knowns. We can see certain things coming down the pike, and when we think about how we motivate people into action instead of holding them back in fear, the perspective of the advocate politician, which you now are, is particularly salient. So I wonder if you could share with us, you said climate change is fundamentally a people problem. It starts with the people. So if you could share with us what you've learned in doing advocacy work around the slow-moving and fast-manifesting issue of climate change, we'd be grateful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe to answer that approach to me learning about what climate change is, for me as an advocate about people, was first that reflection and truly understanding our individual relationship to the issues that we're talking about and the crises that we are talking about. Because fundamentally, I believe that lived experience is that under-resourced component to the way we make decisions and take action on things that are changing the world every single day. So for me, as an advocate, I started working in climate at 12 years old. I'm 21 now. You know, to take that step back and really understand what that meant to me as an individual. And this is probably a controversial thing to say, but it's not about the trees, it's not about the environment. It's from that basis of connection and empathy to people and the impact that that has on people's lives. And I think, you know, maybe something that we offer as a younger generation is that heightened sense of empathy to other generational peers that are out on the front lines of the issues that we're facing. I come from an incredible place of privilege, being an Australian, a white male, and all these things. So that connection to empathy and actually understanding the lived experience impact that something has is what directed me to understand what I was an advocate for. And then, you know, now in this position as an elected member and, you know, finding yourself as an advocate, talking about all the issues, not just climate change. It's been a big learning curve to go from one topic to actually the interconnectiveness across multiple different portfolios. Is again, bringing yourself back to what is my individual relationship to this crisis and how do I share that with my peers to inspire empowerment, to be part of that movement, to be part of that solution and not be scared to actually sit back and be anxious or think of things as they're too difficult to work for, but actually put yourself in the shoes of what does it mean to you and how does your lived experience actually resource decision makers to make decisions that are addressing these issues in the way that directly impacts people first.
And what in your mind then has been most effective? Because of course, you know, again, mapping out crisis upon crisis, you described it so well, just creates that, you know, frisson of anxiety. But to get from anxiety to action, to overcome, to find resourcefulness, and we use the word resilience here on stage already. What have you found to be most powerful? I think empathy is an incredible tool, but can you share with us a particular experience or a particular sort of process?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging question in politics because, you know, I think the biggest tool I have is, and the biggest lesson I've had into talking about all these issues and the interconnected approaches that we must take, is you need to trust people that you generally wouldn't trust. And, you know, that's the approach we need to take. which is a really scary thing. When you're elected in a position to represent people, you take that really seriously, and you really have to choose what you carry in your bag every day, because you can't take every issue into that bag when you're discussing the changes that are going to impact these people. And it's really hard to decide what issues you do carry and what issues you don't carry for that day. And it's a daily thing that you decide. So trusting people who might be carrying the issues that you care about, but not in the same way as you, is that biggest tool for me. And it's really hard to find that within yourself, to trust somebody that you wouldn't normally publicly say, I trust you, I believe in you. But that's the approach that we must take.
Well, in a way that links beautifully to the nucleus of this symposium, as we heard earlier, because in the 60s, of course, the mantra was trust nobody over 30, and yet here we are, having difficult and open conversations of an intergenerational nature. But I'm being glib, but it's true. That is the hard work. And Sophie, when you came into your role, I mean, first of all, you were young coming into elected office, but you clearly realized there was something missing in the conversation, and in precisely the ability to have sort of an institutional frame in which to build trust and have those conversations and get into this idea of longer-term planning, longer-term thinking, especially from a Welsh perspective, in the middle of the, of Brexit, of different views challenging the country, in a position where people weren't even talking to one another such that they can get a view on what the different challenges are ahead. So can you share a little bit about your own perspective coming into your role and setting up this intergenerational form of exchange?
Yes, I mean, like yourself, I was elected when I was 21, and I think when you enter into that sort of political environment, the thing that's presented is the rough and tumble of politics and the debates and that sort of nature of politics. But actually, the thing that I think really impacts politicians is what is happening back in their constituencies, the stories that they hear from people, and on almost every level or every person that you come into contact with those issues, if you keep asking the question why, so you're homeless or you need rehousing, why? There's a mental health issue, why? And you keep going back and back and asking that question why, and you realise that all issues are long-term issues, and in most cases, problems have resulted by failure of the state to intervene at an earlier point, therefore failure of the state to plan long-term and to prevent. And so the role that I've more recently been in for the last 7 years as the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, actually a politically independent role. I went into rehabilitation from politics and I came out clean. Actually, though, having that insight into how the system works and how the system fails, but a willingness and a passion really to stand outside it and then challenge it, I think, was critically important. So just a tiny bit of an overview of what we've done in Wales to give that perspective. So in 2015, Wales became the first country in the world to legislate to protect the interests of future generations. We passed a law called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which does a number of things. First of all, those of you who work in the field of sustainable development or connect back to sustainable development will recognise this principle from the Brundtland Commission. Our law requires all of our public institutions, so that's all of our local authorities, our health institutions, national agencies like our Environment Agency, and significantly the Welsh Government are named in the legislation Welsh ministers themselves to demonstrate how they're taking decisions in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Very important principle. It then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals, and this is one of the most critical elements. These wellbeing goals were developed in conversation with the citizens of Wales, where we posed the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? And people got into a much different space of, out of their immediacy, and actually what do we value as citizens? We value the rich natural assets that we have in Wales. We value our culture, our language, our heritage. Actually, there's a real sense of fairness and social justice in Wales that we want to create. And that was kind of really, really important. And I suppose going back to Lord Griffiths' point on, we mustn't be, we must face up to the sort of reality of things, but not become disillusioned. I think there's a real challenge at the moment when we're trying to get people to think to the long term and think to the future. And even in popular culture, about 99% of what is covered in the future is some sort of dystopian future. It's all about challenges. It's all about how do we sort of mitigate and what might the risks be. But where is this positive vision for the future? And essentially, that's what Wales has done. It's set out these 7 long-term wellbeing goals, a vision for a country. Now, you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a long-term vision, but it's completely revolutionary. There's no other country in the world that has a long-term vision beyond electoral cycles. And that's the critical point. So when we're asking people to act and think in the long term, everything within the system stops that happening. Think to the long term, we say, and plan to the long term, and here's your annual budget. Act to prevent problems from occurring. That is actually a principle in our legislation too. Long-term prevention. Prevent these problems from occurring. And by the way, the thing we're going to measure you on in terms of your performance are short-term, either economic outputs or whether your ambulance turned up on time or whether you got to see a consultant on time, not whether, why do you need an ambulance in the first place, and is that something that we could have done to prevent it. So everything in the system kind of butts up against that. So that's where it's so important that we have these legal requirements on our politicians and all of our institutions to act in the long term. And I think before we had that legislation in Wales, there were lots of people who were sort of trying to, I suppose, maintain the status quo, these short-term targets and measures. I'm very sorry to say to the lawyers and the finance directors in the room, they were often the lawyers and the finance directors. Sometimes I call them the abominable no-men. But what this legislation has actually done is helped to transform them into the phenomenal yes-men, saying that actually what we're doing here is we have this obligation to our future generations. And, if it's the law that turns you on, we have a law that actually requires us to act in the interests of future generations. So these people in our public sector offices, sometimes they're politicians, often they're officials, they're public sector workers, who for very many years have been able to see that there's a better way of doing things, but the system has frustrated them. So I call these people the frustrated champions. When you pass a law that challenges that system and requires fundamental reform, what those frustrated champions say is it gives us permission to challenge the system and permission to make some of those big transformations. So I think there's something here. Wales is a tiny country of just over 3 million people, but I think we've done something quite special in terms of passing this law. The UN Secretary-General has recently proposed that there should be a UN declaration for future generations and the appointment of a UN special envoy. But imagine if every country in the world, every politician in the world was operating within a legal mandate to think and act for the long term, with someone like me on the outside who's going to call them out if they don't.
Well, I have a feeling that this is going to resonate or has resonated already, and I see this by the nodding with Minister Lee, and we'll go. I want to get to this idea of how you've all expressed a different form of listening and how we turn better listening into strategy, because that's a leap too. But Toby, I want to go back to you for just a moment here, because now we've heard from Sophie the power of mandating this, the power of the law. That's, culturally, I could see how there are differences there, and we talked yesterday at length about incentives and how you change incentives such that you might get there. If you look at your own situation, Tasmania, but if you look even larger at Australia and Australia in the region, would that kind of a mandate, would that kind of a sort of legal context, that kind of shift work? Or are there sort of levels of how we have to think about building that conversation? We talked about the UN, that could come from the transnational level, but maybe one needs to find one's own path that's culturally dependent. How are you thinking about that in Australian context?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think cultural dependency on these sort of procedures is very present. Not every economy, not every community works the same. So there is that fundamental thing that you need to find your own path. But that in an Australian context, mandating these sort of things. I think, as a young person in politics, the view of having a difference of opinion should not be at the loss of collaboration is present in Australian politics. So I think that mandate, would become a tokenistic thing to things we're already doing right. But a dialogue, mandating a dialogue and ensuring that these type of things continue to happen, so when things do change or there is a shift in the political stability that we currently sit in and all these things, that's probably something that we look at in terms of our appropriation to these type of things. But yeah, I think it's a very dynamic, conversation to have, because not every country is going to have the same thing. And the UN, the Special Envoy on Youth, and all these things, probably do play an international role in that intergenerational equity as a component. And some UN branches, like the UNFCCC, have started to do this really well. But yeah, I think that answers the question.
Minister Lee, we talked before we got on the podium, and this gets again to the different legal context. Singapore, as a city-state, as a specific form of a democracy, has the advantage of at once being extremely close to its citizens. So for those of you in the room who haven't been in Singapore, I wanted Minister Lee to share a little bit about what happens when the government comes to you, which is to say, knocks at your door and asks you to talk to it. And then what happens, and this gets to Sophie's point about how do you then make that into useful information? How do you make that into data? And I don't mean necessarily the data that we think about now that's necessarily technology bound, but just in terms of knowledge. How did you transfer that knowledge, and what do you do with that? Yeah. Can you share a little bit about how, this is very specific in part to the Singaporean context, and that's why I wanted you, Toby, to weigh in on that for Australia. Can you share a little bit about how you do that and how that helps in the forecasting or getting into the long-term planning component?
Yes, certainly. First, I think, harking back to what Toby and Sophie said earlier about legal mandate, as well as political responsibility to plan for the long term, and incentives, perverse incentives sometimes, or political structures, sometimes causing people to sacrifice the long term because really they're focused on the next electoral cycle, right, or the immediate demands of the electorate, and therefore, know it or not, you become more and more myopic. There is benefit in having both political and legislative structures that mandate that long-term view. For example, in Singapore, and I'll get to the point about going door to door, but we have legislation that requires us to plan for our city's land use with a 50-year horizon.
Right.
50-year horizon. And in the midst of COVID, we had to begin that process to galvanize not just government agencies, but corporates, individuals, communities, to talk about the future of Singapore and what it means in terms of the way we use that precious land that we have and the very limited resources that we have. But in doing that, it takes political will and commitment to see through the conversations needed in order to put that plan together. And so that meant having lots and lots of conversations. And over time, you pick up the lessons. You can either create an echo chamber, you have a whole room full of people with like-minded interests, and then you get people just resonating with each other, and it just gets louder and louder and louder, championing one particular two-dimensional perspective. Or you could take the harder road and have what you call diverse rooms. Very hard to manage, but remembering that as government, we are not owners, we are actually stewards. We're trying to navigate a diverse electorate with complicated needs that may differ from each other, and therefore having conversations with diverse groups of people. Sometimes there will be fireworks. And you just need to make sure that people can see each other's perspective. And one conversation I had on housing, and housing is always a hot topic in Singapore, public housing in particular, because 80% of Singaporeans live in government-built public housing, and issues of eligibility always arise. Does a young person have a right to a home versus a senior, versus a three-generational family, versus a single mother, and so on? And some of these conversations can be very fraught, can be very emotional, but when you bring diverse chambers together and you can manage that political process well, you see that people get to understand other people's point of view and other people's perspective and not just their own. I don't think that always results in good outcomes, But by and large, our experience is that it leads to some meeting of the minds and connection of the heart. But beyond that, because we're a city-state, 5.5 million people, 8,000 people per square kilometer, and our politics is a city politics. That's the level of accountability. I'm responsible for urban planning, construction, conservation in the day. In the evening, I'm responsible for municipal issues, whether the litter is swept, whether the trees are pruned, whether the light bulbs are changed. That is the nature of a city-state. And so what we do is we need to keep very close to our people. Once a week, all elected members of parliament will hold what you call in the UK a surgery. We call that a Meet the People session. Start in the evening, end rather late. You could have upward of 100 families coming to see you with their issues. But when they come to you with issues, you're asking for some help, some dispensation, some appeal. But then you start to pick up feedback and you start connecting the dots, not just in your own experience, but talking to fellow members of parliament, talking to ministers, saying, hey, is that what you're seeing on the ground? This issue with housing affordability, this issue with cost of living, this issue with pollution. And then you start to not just address individuals' concerns, but start to have another source of connectivity with the people. And then once a week, what we strive to do is to knock on doors. We visit a community every week in the evening. Say for me, it's a Monday or a Tuesday evening. After dinner, 7 o'clock, 7:30, I'll go with my volunteers. We have what we call HDB blocks. I'm not sure you know what it means. It's a tall apartment tower. All right? Some of them could have like 500 households because it's really long. From one end, you time the clock, walk to the other end, 5 minutes. All right? And times 12 stories of that. And you knock and people tell you their concerns, and you hear straight from the people that you serve what they think about your policies and what kinds of issues they face on a day-to-day basis. So it helps us keep a finger on the pulse of society on various issues: cost of living, housing, sustainability, climate change, transport, what they think about Singapore's position geopolitically with our neighbors and with big powers. They will tell you that. And that helps us to supplement the feel that we get from the data that's collected through surveys, through feedback channels, through social media, through email. And that, in a city-state environment, allows us to get a better feel of the issues that affect the city and then affect the country. And I think this is something that many cities can also do.
And to say a little bit more, I worked for Mayor Bloomberg, and we had a 311 dashboard, which is when people would call in 311 with their issues about the city. And I will not tell you, I mean, that is an incredible, you walk in and it's wall-to-wall screens and it's wall-to-wall information such that you always know where the pulse of the city is based on this one system. That system dwarfs what Singapore has. The kind of sensor technology, the kind of heat mapping, so the additional data that, of course, a place like Singapore can collect about the state of the city at any given time in combination with what you said is really remarkable. It's almost time for you to ask your questions of my, I think, formidable and thoughtful panel. So get ready. We have some roving mics. You can start to put your hands up. And I want to wrap this second round of questions with a question to Sophie. You know, we've talked about politics and policy now as if it can be an integrative, just regenerative place where you can really make progress for people. But I mentioned in the intro, we've lost 5 years of our joint humanity, so something obviously isn't going right. So this is fundamentally also a conversation about power. Every conversation is. And if I think about, the UK system, the fight that the countries that make up the United Kingdom have had in terms of resources, financial resources, if I think about devolution, going in positive aspects, negative aspects. What you have established in Wales, if you think about your own context, who picks up that bicycle chain and makes it whole of UK? Who picks up that bicycle chain and makes it, broadens that narrative? Who is endangered by that kind of power? And who is emboldened by the kind of powerful resource that you have created?
Well, I suppose from the perspective of the work that we've done in Wales, others are starting to follow. So the Scottish National Party, who formed the government in Scotland, have committed to having a Future Generations Act. There's elections not long off at a UK level. The last Labour manifesto committed to a Future Generations Act for the UK. There's been a private members bill more recently in the UK Parliament. It would make everything much easier and better, I would suggest, if the whole of the UK and perhaps the whole of the world had something akin to a Future Generations Act. What we see are some tensions between some of the progressive things that we want to do. So if I give you an example of a universal basic income, of which I'm a big advocate of. Why is that? Because if we look to the long term, the biggest impact on human health alongside climate change is actually living in poverty. So the state ends up in the UK, particularly because of our National Health Service, picking up the costs of poverty in its National Health Service, in its criminal justice system, and all of these things. Also, we see that, in terms of thinking to the long term, our welfare state, our safety net for citizens, was created at a time when the gig economy wasn't a thing. Mm-hmm. 0-hour contracts weren't a thing. The massive worrying trajectory in terms of poor mental health amongst young people in particular was not a thing. The demands that we see now on the healthcare system weren't the same. So our welfare state, I think, is broken. And I think that if we're looking to how we redefine that safety net to enable humans not just to survive but to thrive, a universal basic income has got to be part of that debate. So in Wales, we are piloting a universal basic income. Well, it's not quite the U, it's a basic income because it's targeting initially care leavers, those young people who are leaving the state care system, with a big evaluation wrapped around that. Now, if we wanted to roll that out further, we would need cooperation with the UK government, and currently they are not cooperating. Mm-hmm. So this is where you get these sort of tensions, and actually some of these tensions do play in, I think, to debates around independence and so on. And, personally, I'm not in favour of splitting up the UK, but I think when not all nations of the UK are moving perhaps at the same progressive pace, that does cause this increased interest in independence. And I think, there is probably some similar things in reverse, actually, that played out during the Brexit debate. And I think all of those things are incredibly worrying, because we need to be coming together, not splitting apart. I think the final thing that I want to say is around the sort of importance of taking an integrated and holistic approach to the things that we do. So alongside short-termism being endemic in public policy making, silo-based mentality and working is completely endemic as well. But of course, everything is connected to everything. On the one hand, our medics tell us that climate change is one of the biggest threats to human health. On the other hand, if the healthcare sector globally was a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitter of carbon in the world. So what we need to be doing is seeing those sort of joined up approaches. So it should be just as much the responsibility of our healthcare system to decarbonise as it should to be to treat people when they're well. It should be just as much responsibility for our healthcare system to be developing good quality, decent jobs which take people out of poverty, using their supply chain, their procurement and so on to do that, as it should to be developing the treatments that they're developing. So there's something, again, around these principles of decision-making, and ours are plan for the long term, prevent problems from occurring or getting worse, integrate your actions, so recognise the consequences and the connections between policy issues, collaborate with each other, so work in partnerships similar to the things you're talking, and involve citizens. I think if we were to completely wipe the slate clean on, a plethora of, frameworks for good governance and decision-making, those are 5 pretty common sense principles for decision-making. In fact, the minister who took our legislation through described it as the Common Sense Act for that reason. The problem with or the reason why we need to legislate for common sense is because, sadly, in public policy making, common sense isn't often
That's
that common.
gotten lost. Yeah, I hear you. Okay, good. Hands going up. We have about 12 minutes for questions, so we're going to start way in the back and move our way forward. So I have, now look at everybody go. See, everybody's gotten warmed up. Okay, starting with the hand that waves back there. Please introduce yourself. Make it brief. Make sure whatever you say ends with your voice going up and a question mark.
Thank you very much. My name is Louis Klein, representing Agora 42, philosophical business magazine. I very much enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed how you unfolded the reaction to the polycrisis, permacrisis, though it sounded very much technocratic, technical in how you go on about it. Yet there was something shining through. At moments, the heart was touched. So I'd like to ask the question to the entire podium, the legendary Turner question. What's love got to do with it?
I love that, because I remind you, one of our 7 principles in our new generational contract is care. And so that links directly. I'm going to take another question right ahead of our last gentleman. So we're going to go 2 and 2, and I'll group more geographically, not to worry. Let's have a second question here.
Thank you, Catherine. Ali Mirage from the UK. I'm a banker. Desmond, there are elections going on in the UK, local elections at the moment. If you fancy a secondment, we could do with your help. We need some good governance. You talked about political and legislative structures. One idea I've always had is like the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK should be made cross-party and given sort of statutory power. What practical measures can we take to embed that in terms of practical decision-making? And Sophie, you mentioned the Generational Act that you were talking about, Future Generations Act. How is it policed? Because ultimately, a politician could say they've made a decision in the best interest of future generations, but it's highly subjective. So how do you actually police that in reality? Thanks.
Okay, so to my esteemed panel, short answers, because we only have 10 minutes. Everybody has to get out of this room. So we're going to start with Toby first, because people-centered. What's love got to do with it?
What's love got to do with it? I think everything, and a very quick story that I'm going to answer this with is recently I had a very challenging public appearance, and somebody said to me, "Stop being such a child." And then later went on to say that children and young people have more empathy because the first lesson you're taught is how to share chocolate with your brother. And I turned around and I said, "You gave me criticism and being such a child. And I'm going to say thank you for telling me I'm empathetic and living my inner child and responding to that way of actually let's share empathy and connect with one another." So I answer that with a question of where did our inner child stop? And how do we bring that back out to embrace the values of empathy and care and put that into practice to where we are today? So that's how I'd answer that question.
Desmond, what does love have to do with it? And I'm going to ask you to also respond to Holly's question on infrastructure at the same time.
Yeah, dealing with COVID, a crisis that affects lives and jobs, it's not technocratic at all. You have the science, and you make the best out of it in a fog of war, and you make decisions knowing that they can mean life or death. You can make the right decision, and you're lucky. You make the wrong decision, and lives will be lost, jobs may be lost. And those last 3 years, for me, as a young member of the administration, it was a baptism of fire. And there were many occasions where it was not the logic or the instruction. It was the sense that we are fighting this together. I'll give you an example. I visited, because my ministry looks after the quarantine facilities, and we turned some chalets into quarantine facilities, and we needed to have people to man them. And mind you, there were no tests, there were no vaccines at the time. Cast your mind back to 2020, 2021. And I visited the officers from the auxiliary police who were doing that job, and some were very stressed. They broke down in tears. They were worried for their health, their safety, for their children when they go home. You have to assure them it's about the heart. It's not about you do that job. You must be with them. The other occasion was when we had a circuit breaker, which is for you what we call a lockdown. And I discussed with the health minister. I was then looking after the social and family ministry. I looked after welfare homes, destitute homes. He looked after nursing homes. And we said, look, what's happening in parts of the world, including in Europe, where people were dying in nursing homes because infection got in. And we said, we will have to consider the unthinkable in Singapore and ask all the staff, both Singaporean staff and our foreign staff who worked side by side with us, persuade them to quarantine with their patients on the same floor in their home for 1 month. And for some of them, they're Muslim, it's a month of Ramadan. Cannot go home. Stay in your facility, don't even cross floors. Otherwise, we'll move you to a hotel every day, totally segregated public health. And I had a Zoom call, and the CEOs were like, a very tough call. And I talked to the health minister and said, we must go and talk to the frontliners, go down to the facilities. When we arrived, they were waving at us from the different floors. And it was very emotional. It was like, we are asking a lot from you, and we don't know it's the right decision. Please trust us. We'll be with you. And we got thumbs up, we had tears, and none the worse for wear, thankfully. All right, none the worse for wear. So it is not just about technocratic decision-making. Crisis or no crisis, the decision is an act of faith based on the best-known data that you have, and working with your public officers and the private sector, you make the call, and you stand or fall with it. For Ellie's question about... Ellie's question about infrastructure, I suppose in much larger countries, the problem is always delayed. You can always afford to sprawl. But in Singapore, we have very hard trade-offs. We have 8,000 people per square kilometre. We want housing to be livable. We want healthcare. People desire more education. We want to conserve our biodiversity within the city, not outside the city. You can't conserve anything outside the city because outside the city is another person's country, right? So everything is magnified and intense, much more intense than much larger countries with many cities, lots of hinterland. And so when it comes to infrastructure, we have, of course, legislative framework, but ultimately balancing the needs of today's generation and tomorrow's generation, and telling them that, yes, we have to control eligibility for certain facilities and access to housing because we need to keep some land for people not yet born, who can't vote, who can't speak up, keeping optionalities for them. I met one of my predecessors in my department, and he said, when we cleared this land, we were tempted to just build housing because there was need, but we bit the bullet, we kept it vacant for your generation. Please make good use of it and touch it only if you need to. And I'm reminded of what Peter Foster said yesterday at dinner. He quoted this quote, that we do not inherit this earth from our ancestors. We merely borrow it from our children. And that is our karma, that is our responsibility. And sometimes it means making difficult decisions, whether it's land use, and land use versus housing, land use versus conservation, land use versus healthcare, making people upset sometimes because it is in the interest of some other group or another generation not yet born. And I think
Sophie,
the Welsh approach is absolutely wonderful.
I want to come straight to you, but I want to get one more female question in. So I want to go over here, please, if I can. Beautiful patterned blouse. Next generation question, and then Sophie gets the first stab at the answer. We have literally 3 minutes and 45 seconds remaining.
Hi, I'll make this quick. Hi, my name is Saskia. I'm studying environmental change and management at the University of Oxford. And you mentioned a little bit about the difficulty of the policy cycles, and some of the longer term decisions you're facing have trade-offs for the generations today. In France, we're seeing demonstrations because of the pension reforms. So I was wondering to all of you, are you willing to risk your own popularity in your political role and your potential career to make decisions now that may not be completely favorable to your electorate? Thank you very much.
And Saskia is a leader of tomorrow, which you will see on her name badge. Which is yellow. So following up on your earlier assignment, go talk to Saskia in the coffee break. Sophie gets to respond.
Okay, I'll try and respond to that whilst building in love and infrastructure. In terms of what's love got to do with it, love has got everything to do with it. If you look at the World Health Organization Health Equity Status Report, the reasons for the differences in life expectancy, I talked about poverty, 29% is about your living conditions, 19% is about social and human capital, the quality of your relationships. Do you live in an area where there's a sense of community, and can you influence that community? So far from that sense of kind of focus on well-being, relationships and so on being the soft, fluffy stuff that the state shouldn't get involved in. Actually, it's critical to that hard metrics of whether, how long you're going to live. And in Wales, we've built those sorts of concepts around. We run programmes throughout our schools called Roots of Empathy. Our whole school curriculum is built around being ethical and informed citizens. Imagine if every one of us in this room had been, or every person in government had been through an education curriculum that taught them to be ethical and informed citizens. That's, I think, our sort of expression of love to the next generation and so on. In terms of infrastructure then and how willing we are to take difficult decisions. This is a live case in point in Wales, and it goes, I'll speak also to the enforcement point on the Future Generations Act. So I was an independent commissioner. I couldn't compel anyone to do anything, couldn't force them to do anything or stop them doing anything. I did have powers to review government decisions or decisions of any public institutions. One of the live issues was a government plan to build, to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity building a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion. We all know these issues. We've got a problem with congestion. What do? We build another road. 15 years down the line, that road is full and we build another road. I intervened in that issue and asked the government to demonstrate to me how they'd applied the Future Generations Act to that decision, how it was in line with our goal of a prosperous Wales, which talks about a productive, innovative, low-carbon society which acts on climate change, how it was in line with the goal of a resilient Wales, which talks about enhancing and maintaining our ecosystems, how it was in line with the goal of a healthier Wales when we have increasing rates of obesity and illegal levels of air pollution, how it was in line with our goal of a more equal Wales. 25% of the lowest income families in that area don't own a car, and you will find that that is common throughout. So the government cancelled that road building scheme following that intervention, and they've gone beyond that, and there is now a moratorium on all road building in Wales. Now, that is a politically difficult decision. The minister who took that decision is getting all sorts of stick from the people who wanted a climate emergency to be declared, and it should apply to everything apart from the road that they need in their area. So it does require a huge amount of bravery, but it also requires a legal framework that insists that they act in that way.
So in the briefest possible way to answer that question, going down the line before we say goodbye, would you be willing to give up your power that you have if and for these generational conversations at Equity? Toby, let me guess what your answer is going to be.
Yeah, very quick. I'm a climate advocate, and I've called for political will and confidence to make these decisions. As an advocate, now I'm in this position, I'm like, oh, gee, this is really scary, actually, because I still want to go to the supermarket and get my milk without people being angry with the decision I made. So my approach is announce your decision and have time to convince people that it's the right decision and not be surprised.
So your short answer is yes.
Yeah.
Minister Lee, short answer is yes? Okay, well...
Yeah, that's our role.
First of all, I think this has been a tremendous way to open this discussion, because you have heard that all public policy making, all decision making is based in trust, it's based in empathy, it's based in one of those 7 principles to not just look at long-term crisis in isolation from care and concern and presence with voters and people. All of that has to come together. I think all 3 of you have illustrated this beautifully. All 3 of these people will be here for the next 2 days. You can have these ongoing conversations. Please join me in thanking my 3 panelists.